Good morning, evening, or afternoon to anybody following this channel, Cristiano Moderno. With you, my name is Victor Telles. Um, Today, we're going to look at one of the prophecies in the Bible. You see, yesterday and today in the liturgical calendar, one of the reading involves the reading of Daniel chapter 7. But this is one of those mysterious parts of the Bible. What makes it so mysterious is that it is called the apocalyptic genre. You see, when we look at the Bible, there are specific genres with its own characteristics. And when we study the books, especially the prophecies, you need to be aware of what genre it is and its characteristics. And this genre has a very specific language. You see, the apocalyptic genre is designed to be symbolic because it's designed to have a very specific meaning that could be very controversial at the time it was written. So it had to be written in such a way that the powers that be would not understand what's going on or would understand very little. Yet the people who it was written for could understand it better. Um, let's see, apocalyptic books in the Bible are the book of Revelation, Daniel, parts of Ezekiel, parts of Zechariah are of apocalyptic nature, and thus they should be looked at and with their symbolic nature. When we study apocalyptic books precisely because of its symbolic nature, we need to forget and not think about our time. You see, the major problem people have when they study prophecy is that they think prophecy, oh, I open the book of Revelation, open the book of Daniel, and see what's going to happen in the future. It's not about our future, it's predicting the future for the time it was written. Number one mistake is that we think, oh, the entire Bible has to do with the future of what's to become for us. But it's not necessarily the case. You see, we hear the word end of time, and we think of the end of history, the last day of the world. No, it's talking about the last day of a set time. You see, there's a time, book of Ecclesiastes, I believe it is, it tells us there's a time for everything. And it tells us exactly that those times, there's a saying in Spanish, um, hay un tiempo para cada plazo. So there's a time when every single time that has been set up for something shall come to pass or has come to pass. It is important, therefore, to understand the cultural, social, and political situations that were going around when these books were written. They were written within a social, historical, and political context in which God manifests his will to the people living in that specific time. But what happens, many of us, from a Western perspective, tend to forget that the book of Revelation was written by a Jew for Jews who were living in captivity in Babylon. And we want to read it as if it were about our times. And this is a major mistake. Just last week, actually a week ago today, I had a debate with an evangelical. Some of you may have seen it in Spanish. And his whole concept of the book of um, and this book was so screwed off because he ignored certain elements in the book of prophecy. And because he was wanting, you see, the apocalyptic books are written in such a way that's easy to twist and makes anybody you want look like a beast. The person I had a debate with hates the Catholic Church, the real Church of Christ, so much that he insisted it had to be it, though he failed to provide proof of it. Why? Because he does not know the meaning of it. Now, today we're going to talk about Daniel chapter 7 and what this prophecy actually means within the context that it was written. Important to understand, this prophecy was written around the 6th century BC. That makes it about at least, at the very least, 2,530 years, and at the very most, 2,600 years ago. It was written not in a pure Hebrew, because remember, by this time, Daniel had already been living in Babylon some time. And as the first chapter of Daniel informs us, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had tried to impose the Aramaic language on the Hebrews who had been taken captive to Babylon. So as we read through Daniel in the original language, we find that it is in some mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic. You see, it is only natural that when two languages collide, loanwords start transferring from one language to another. English has some Spanish words from when English and Spanish first collided in the 1800s. Words like rodeo, lasso come from Spanish, and they became part of the English language. The Spanish speaking community has words like troca, which comes from the word truck, parquear, which comes from the word parking. Languages collide, new words, new expressions arise. So we see that the Hebrew in Daniel is not pure biblical Hebrew, but it has a mixture of some Aramaic words. Or some people like to say that it is Aramaic with some Hebrew. Either way you would look at it, it's correct. Now, having said this, and having said this long introduction, let's dive into what the book actually says. Please open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 7. And let's begin. The first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. All right, this is telling us when he had this. He was one of the kings. He was a regent. We need to understand this. You see, in the genealogy of um, of the kings, we find that Nebuchadnezzar's great grandson, Nabonidus, I forget whom of the two, was very devout to his pagan god. And it was not uncommon for him to take several pilgrimages throughout his life, and each of his pilgrimages lasted 7 years. So he would leave his oldest son in charge of the kingdom as he went away on pilgrimage. His son was Belshazzar. um, we see here that Belshazzar is ruling. That means that the real king is out on pilgrimage. We know that his last pilgrimage lasted 7 years. We know that the Babylonian Empire happened in the year 539. We had 7 years to that because that would be 546. So we know now that this dream that that Daniel had at this time was in the year 546 BC. 1000, let's see, 500 69 years ago. Keep that in mind. It's one this dream. Daniel had this dream approximately 1,569 years ago. We can see that because it says first year of the Belshazzar, that narrows down the year to the year 546 plus 2023 that we're on. That comes up to five, excuse me, 2,569 years ago. Now we see also why he had to do it symbolically, why he had to use the apocalyptic language. Belshazzar was not too friendly to the Jews, as Nebuchadnezzar had been. We just saw in chapter 5 a couple of days ago how Belshazzar um, profaned the holy vessels that had been used in the temple before before being taken to captivity. Now, so we know that Daniel had this very important dream, so important he had to write it symbolically. Let's see what it was. Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. In other words, he did not write the specifics, but the general idea. Which means these dreams were even more detailed than it was, which is very impressive considering how detailed these dreams were for those who understand the language. Let's continue. Verse 2. Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there were before me four winds of heaven. Four winds. That means it involves the entire known world. You see, in the apocalyptic language, the number four represents nature. The four corners of the world: north, south, east, and west. The four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Notice, they were in Babylon, so they were not anywhere near a sea. But usually when they talk about the Great Sea, it's talking about the Mediterranean. Yet Babylon is miles and miles away. So what he is telling us is that these beasts that are about to rise had some influence around the Mediterranean. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. By beast, let's not think of any regular animal. They're actually monsters, what we would now call monsters. But yet these monsters had specific characteristics for specific reasons. Let's look at them carefully. Verse 4 tells us the first beast. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. Let's take our time and analyze this one correctly. It's a lion with wings. Today we call it a griffin. In the ancient Hebrew and Babylonian language, it was called a shatu. I'm sure you have seen this around. Why a lion with wings? Well, I'm sure that people, even though it was supposed to be symbolic, I'm sure a lot of people understood this first one because it involves heraldry. You see, just like today, people back then had each nation had a heraldic symbol. Let me give you an example. Today, when we talk about the United States, what animal comes to your mind? The bald eagle. You ask a Mexican, what bird comes to your mind when you think about Mexico? They would tell you a golden eagle. You go to Guatemala and ask somebody from Guatemala, what animal comes to your mind when you think about Guatemala? They will say a quetzal. Back in the Cold War, it was very typical to see images of a bear facing off in a golden eagle. I mean, not a golden eagle, a bald eagle, to symbolize the Cold War. The bald eagle representing the United States and the bear representing Russia. You understand? Now, every country has a heraldic animal that represents it. England is represented by 3 lions, and so on. In Babylon, the heraldic animal to represent the Babylonian Empire was a shatu, which was what? A lion with golden wings. So the first animal tells us straightforward what it is. It is a Babylonian Empire, the Empire of Babylon. But it tells us that this lion had its wings plucked off, and yet he was lifted up like a man. To understand this, we need to understand chapter 4. We don't have much time to look at chapter 4 thoroughly, but for you to understand this more properly, I do recommend that you find the time sometime during the day to read chapter 4. But in general, the gist of chapter 4 is this: Nebuchadnezzar goes through a fit of arrogance. Walking through his kingdom, he's like, oh, how great is my kingdom! I built this, I did this, I did that. He's all bragging. God sends him, according to the way it's presented and according to biblical um, Hebrew, he is stricken with some form of mental illness or some type of evil spirit, using the language they use there, where um, the emperor, King Nebuchadnezzar, is stricken with a disease called lycanthropia, which is that they start thinking that they are an animal. So his arrogance, he gets humiliated. Because of his arrogance, he falls uh, victim to his sickness, where he all of a sudden loses his mind and starts living like an animal. Leaves his palace, never sits back down on his throne, goes and moves into a cave, crawling on all fours, eating from the grass like any other animal. There is even a picture that represents King Nebuchadnezzar like a madman crawling on all fours, very creepy. In other words, because of his arrogance, King Nebuchadnezzar was humiliated and brought down to the level of an animal. The wings from the arrogance that he had, because Nebuchadnezzar was so proud of what he had achieved as emperor, he gets humiliated. Thus, the wings are plucked out. But towards the end of chapter 4, right when he's about to be cured from this fit of insanity that King Nebuchadnezzar had, he looks up in heaven and says, what a beautiful sky. There must be some amazing God up there living in such a beautiful creation. At that moment, Nebuchadnezzar recovers his sanity, stands back from all four, and starts walking again with a proud walk of a king, but this time a bit more humble. So that's where it tells us that this lion, who had been humiliated, wings plucked out, emperor brought down to the level of an animal, is then lifted up to walk like a man. Nebuchadnezzar, once he learns his lesson, gets to recover his humanity again. That's what this is telling us about. Nebuchadnezzar, even though at this time Nebuchadnezzar was no longer the king, Nebuchadnezzar remained as a figure for it. Even up to today, when people think about the Babylonian Empire, they don't think of Nabopolassar, they don't think about Nabunassar, they don't think about Nabuzardan, or even Belshazzar. They think about Nebuchadnezzar. Let's move on. So we know the first beast was the Roman Empire, um, represented by a lion. the Shatu, which in turn represents King Nebuchadnezzar as a representative of Babylonian royalty. Now let's look at the second monster. There before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. Why a bear? It was raised up on one of the sides. In other words, two sides, it was unevenly weighted. And it had three ribs. Why three? We're going to talk about it right now. In its mouth, between its teeth, it was told to get up and eat your fill of flesh. The first verse already told us that this prophecy, verse number 5, is fulfilled 7 years after Daniel has his dream. Okay, the second beast looks like a bear. We know that in the year 539, Cyrus the Great invades Babylonia and takes over, overthrows the Babylonian Empire, and establishes what's called the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, which lasted from 539 BC through 333 BC. He was a ruler of what is known today as a Persian Empire. Here is where the bear comes in. You see, in ancient Judaism, in ancient angelology, and even in early Christianity, there was this study called angelology, which was the study of angels, which has the angels divided into 9 choirs. One of these choirs is known as a principalities. What was the job of the angels known as principalities? You guys heard of the guardian angel. We all have our own guardian angel, caring for us, protecting us, guiding us. Well, the principalities were the same, but for nations. Every nation had its own principality assigned to it. Israel's principality was the archangel Michael. He was a guardian angel for the nation of Israel, and afterwards for the church. That he was a principality for God's people. Just the same, every nation had a different a different angel, a different principality over it. We see this reflected in other parts of the book of Daniel. For example, in Daniel chapter 10, it tells us about the prince of Persia. Not talking obviously about the physical human being ruling Persia at that moment, because during that time, the prince of Persia was the the human prince of Persia was Darius, who was very friendly to the Jewish people. But yet, when Daniel talks in chapter 10 about the prince of Persia opposing, he's talking about warfare right there between the prince of Persia and Michael. It literally tells us right there in Daniel chapter 10. I forget the verse. So, right there, he's talking about the principalities, the angels over the nations. And the angel that was assigned to be the principality or the prince of Persia, his name was Doviel. Doviel in Hebrew means the bear of God. So we see that the second beast is represented as a bear because the prince of Persia, the angel assigned to Persia, was manifested as a bear that belonged to God. So when he says that the second beast looked like a bear, he's talking about the principality assigned to Persia. He's telling us clear, straightforward, that that soon the king of Babylonia was going to be killed by the king of Persia, because the angel of Persia was going to overthrow the angel of Babylonia. The second detail we see is that it has one of its sides raised over the other. It was kind of walking crooked. Why is this? Cyrus was identified, or he went by the name King of the Persians and the Medes. In other words, he considered himself not an emperor of one empire, but a king of two nations, Persia, Media. Obviously, both kingdoms were not going to be sharing the same power. Persia overtook Media. Therefore, the bears walking crooked, the superiority of Persia over Media, both being ruled by the same Persian emperor, the Achaemenid Empire, in this case, Cyrus the Great. It had three ribs in its mouth. Now it's telling us something about history. Remember, this was at about the year 546. You see, the Babylonian Empire had two allies. Before Cyrus took over the Persian Empire, this Persian Empire was controlled by another king. The Babylonians were allied with the previous king of Persia and with the king that previous king of Persia controlled what is now northern Syria, part of Azerbaijan, and over to what is now Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. The Babylonian Empire controlled what is now Iraq, Kuwait, northern Saudi Arabia, Syria, Israel, and parts of Egypt. But then there was a third ally who controlled what is now Armenia and Turkey. This was called the Kingdom of Lydia. Um, in the year 549 BC, that's 3 years before this vision, Cyrus the Great overthrows his uncle, who was the king of Persia, Nebuchadnezzar's ally, and claims the Persian throne for himself, establishing the Achaemenid Empire. First rib. Then he goes up north. Notice he starts with Persia, which is the one in the middle. This cuts the communication between Babylonia and Lydia, so they cannot ally themselves amongst them, because in order for Lydia to get to Babylonia, they have to cross what's Persian territory, which is now hostile territory to Lydia and to Babylon. So now Cyrus the Great turns his sights northward and attacks the kingdom of Lydia. At this point, he kills its king, King Astyages, and takes over the kingdom of Lydia. Now, Cyrus the Great has extended the Persian Empire to include all the way up to Lydia and parts of Crimea, parts of what's now southern Russia, all the way to the western river of India. I forget the name, Brahmaputra, I think, or is it the Indus or the Ganges? I forget. One of those three. The westernmost river of India. That's two ribs. Cyrus the Great destroyed two kings by this time, and the third king was to be um, Babylonia. When he comes in and kills Belshazzar, you see each of the three ribs represents the kings that were destroyed in order for Persia to rise to power. But that's not enough. It says, go on and continue eating. Get your fill. In other words, Persia had now conquered Babylonia, Lydia. History tells us that the son of Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II, was to take over Egypt. And so on. More lands were to be conquered. After that, verse 6, after that I looked, and there before me was another beast. One looked like a leopard. Why a leopard this time? In Greece, in the city of Argan, Greece, at about 700 BC, a noble family was to be raised up. We go back to the symbols. We have symbols for nations. You also have family crest, symbols for the people. One of the members of this family from the city of Argon was to establish himself in Macedonia time afterwards. Besides, come to think of it, that part is even irrelevant because back in those days, Greece was divided into two parts. The southern part known as Achaia, or to the Hebrews known as Yavan, and the northern part known as Macedonia. Now, and Argon was in the Macedonian part of Greece. One of these persons moved into what's now the Macedonian peninsula, part of what is now or was a few years ago called Yugoslavia, and now it's called Northern Macedonia. He establishes a kingdom there, and Philip II becomes emperor right there. His son becomes the famous Alexander the Great. Now the family crest of this family was a leopard. So it's being specific as to what family. Now he's getting very specific. He's telling us what family was going to be the one in charge of destroying the second beast. And he tells us that this specific family that later became known as the Arganid dynasty of Macedonia, to which Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great belonged to, that they would be the one to come and destroy the Persian Empire and establish the Greek Empire, which ruled the Middle East from the year 333 BC till about 164 BC as well. It tells us on its back it had four wings, like those of a bird, a wing representing speed. Remember, by the year 333, Alexander the Great only had 23 years of age. He was very young. By the age of 23, he had conquered the entire known world, from Greece, Egypt, as far east as India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of southern Russia. The guy was only 23. At the very same age where most people are barely going to school to get some college degree, this guy was already ruler of the entire known world. He rose to power very fast. Hence the wings. But notice, it's four wings. Why was Alexander the Great able to conquer so much power so quickly? He had a very well organized military, which was composed of four, actually five generals, four of which were more recognized: Antigonus, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, Cassander, and the distant fifth, Seleucus, who doesn't come in until chapter 8 with the prophecy of the goats, but that's different. So these four wings are the four generals that helped push Alexander the Great to power: Cassander, Lysimachus, Antigonus, and Ptolemy. These, we see that later it tells us this beast had four heads and it was given authority to rule. These four wings are also connected to the four heads because um, another reason why Alexander the Great rose so quickly to power is that he was so hungry for power that he did not pay attention to any girls. He did not have a queen, except the queens he established through alliances for political purposes. Not so much because of him falling in love with them. He would marry them. Okay, I've married this princess. Now this princess is my queen. Off to conquer the next land. He would not even spend the night with them. As soon as he would marry them, instead of spending the night with his newly acquired wife, he would go into the war room, meet his four generals, and plan out the next land to take over, the next fight. That was his custom. The wife sleeping alone in the bed while he was running off with his generals to plan out the next fight. Therefore, when Alexander the Great died in the year 323, at the young age of 33 years old, he had no descendant, nobody to inherit the empire he had acquired. So, what happened is that the empire of Alexander the Great collapses into four main kingdoms, each ruled by one of these generals: Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, Antigonus. And, and these four, starting in the year 319, they begin what's called the Battle of the Diadochi, which means the Battle of the Rulers, because all four start fighting each other to reconquer what had been Alexander the Great's empire. Now we move on to find out about the fourth beast. After that, in my vision, at night I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening. Of all the beasts, the fourth one was the most scariest one. Very powerful. He had large iron teeth. Iron. We're talking about a time when iron was considered unbreakable. In other words, the power of this beast, of the fourth beast, was considered unbreakable in its time. It crushed and devoured its victims. Nobody could stand up against them. Trampled underfoot whatever was left. So after this next empire came, took over, whatever survived was treated with disdain. It was different from all the former beasts. It had 10 horns. This connects to the to Revelation 17, the so-called Whore of Babylon, which is where this debate rises. The 10 horns, in apocalyptic language, a horn represents a civil power. Normally, it represents the power of an earthly king, a person sitting on a throne. So the Roman Empire had many kings, but it was famous for having 10 specific kings who were extra cruel, who were the 10 most evil kings of the Roman Empire: Nero, Domitian, Hadrian, Trajan, Valentinian, Marcus Aurelius, Septimus Severus, Diocletian, Maxentius, um, Decius. These 10 kings have been known to be, besides Hitler, the 10 most cruel leaders in world history. Some people even say, well, things were so bad, for example, that one of King Emperor Nero's pastimes was to tie people up on posts, set them on fire, so there could be some light for people to see the shows he would put on in his amphitheater. Emperor Nero was so fond of acting and drama and all that, he had a amphitheater built in his own palace, surrounded by specific posts where he would tie specifically converts to Christianity, set them on fire. And from the fire light given off by this fire, people would be able to see his place at night. Human candlesticks you could see, say. Um, and as cruel as this sounds, we are told that Diocletian and Maxentius' cruelty was far worse than that of Nero, who had the human candlesticks. We are told that in the last 10 years, before the fall of pagan Rome, we had 10 times more martyrs in the Catholic Church than the rest of the other 300 years combined. So these 10 cruel emperors, the first one had human candlesticks so people could see his place. And every one of these other 10 cruel kings was more vicious, more cruel, more sadistic than the one before him. Now imagine the 10th one, Maxentius. Eusebius of Caesarea tells us that the 10th of these kings was so vicious and cruel that he would do human sacrifice, sacrificing pregnant women on the altar, and then sacrificing the kid in their womb, tossing up the their innards, and then using that to predict whether to go to fight or not. Disgusting. Hence, this 10th beast, this fourth beast coming up with the 10 horns, the 10 cruel kings who become 10 of the worst, most cruel emperors in human history. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up from among them. You see, so you have these 10 horns, but then there's an 11th horn in there. And what does this 11th horn do? It tells us, um, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This small horn grows, knocks off 3 of the horns, and replaces them. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being. He was a person, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. He was very arrogant. What was this horn? Very important because a lot of people twist this around. A lot of people use this to attack the church, even though we see here that there's not enough here to connect it with any church. Here's why it is important to know the history of the Roman Empire. We know that in the year 282, that's roughly what, 800 years after the prophecy, we see that an emperor called Carus, this is in the year about 281, takes power and claims the Roman Empire. He has a son called Carinus and decides to give half of the empire to his son Carinus. But since Carinus is still young, Carus is afraid that he would get assassinated and hires a bodyguard for him. A very famous general called Diocletian gets hired to be his bodyguard. Unfortunately, this bodyguard does not do his job and only fulfills Carus's worst nightmare. His son, Carinus, is murdered. That very night, they find the body of Emperor Carinus, the son of Emperor Carus, decapitated in his bedroom under very suspicious circumstances. And his bodyguard, Diocletian, is nowhere to be seen. He disappears for a period of 2 months. Upon not being able to find Diocletian, now Carus names his second son, Numerianus, to succeed his brother Carinus. Now we see that Diocletian finally shows up, and interestingly enough, Diocletian is wearing the royal purple, which means Diocletian is claiming the throne for himself. Diocletian has Numerianus killed. Carus declares war on Diocletian, and the night before the two armies are to be engaged, he is also found dead under suspicious circumstances, and Diocletian takes the throne. Hence, we find that Diocletian, who at first was nothing but a mere bodyguard, has Carus killed. Then he has Numerianus killed, and then finally Carus. So he kills off Carinus. Then he kills off Numerianus in the year after that, in 282. And in 283, he kills off Carus. The small horn, Diocletian, kills off 3 emperors before him, before he claims the throne. We see that it says he had the what? He had the eyes. The eyes represent the knowledge. He is a mere person. He's limited to human mentality, but he speaks boastfully. Diocletian was very arrogant. He came to brag about all these things. This same horn makes war against the people of God. Diocletian was one of the last 10 cruel kings of Rome who declared war against the people of the church, against the Catholic Church. He was the one that established a persecution that was so bad that for the last 10 years, the persecution was so terrible that those last 10 years had many more martyrs than the other 300 years combined. He was very arrogant, to the point that when he got tired of ruling Rome, he got in the business of naming other emperors. The army could not choose emperors anymore. He was like, I want you to be emperor. No, I don't want you to be emperor. Kill him, you'll be emperor. No, I don't want you to be emperor anymore. You kill him, you'll be the emperor. And that's how Diocletian was calling the shots now. I mean, he got tired of being an emperor, and now he decided to be a god, raising up emperors and destroying emperors at will. Verse 9. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days refers to God. Ancient of Days is one of the many names the Jewish people give God. The Ancient of Days took his seat, his throne, his power. His clothing was as white as snow, representing his wisdom. The hair of his head was as white as wool. His throne was flaming with fire, power of the Holy Spirit, and its wheels were all ablaze. For the wheels here, we need to connect that to Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 1 tells us that around the throne of God there were 4 angels called the cherubim, and the cherubims were each escorted by 2 wheels known as the Ophanim, Ophanim. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. A river of fire coming up from God. The river of fire is the Holy Spirit. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were open. So now you have, while this fourth beast was ruling, God takes upon his throne, a table set before him, and the books were open. Hear ye, hear ye. Court is now in session. And this terrible beast, this dragon with the 10 horns, the 7 heads. Did it say earlier it had 7 heads? I'm sure it did. Does not, but the other part tells us it does, which are the 7 hills of Rome, not to be confused with the church. It has nothing to do with the church. We see now God takes a seat to judge the beast. The beast has now become the defendant, and he is now on trial. The judge is his Ancient of Days, God Himself. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words of the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The Roman Empire gets destroyed. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority but were allowed to live for a period of time. Persia was still around. Greece was still around. Babylon was still kind of around. But this fourth beast that had destroyed the other previous ones were still had been destroyed. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. So we see, while the fourth beast is ruling, the Son of Man, who's the Son of Man, we see this in the New Testament, Jesus Christ. Coming with the clouds of heaven, approached the Ancient of Day. I was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power, and all nations and peoples of every tongue, every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Jesus Christ has come. When does Jesus Christ come to the earth? When did Jesus Christ come to the earth? During the rule, he is born in Bethlehem when Augustus was emperor of Rome. Is crucified, rises, and ascends to heaven to the time of Tiberius, emperor of Rome. So during the rule of the Roman Empire is when the Messiah comes to earth. Here, right here, David is telling us at what time was the Messiah supposed to come to earth, and telling us that the Messiah was to come to earth during the time of the fourth beast. And we find that prophecy is fulfilled because Christ is born in Bethlehem during the time or freshly after the Roman Empire has gained control of Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the entire Holy Land. We find that the kingdom is then to grow. The church, which this fourth beast was trying to destroy. Remember, the dragon tries to destroy the church, tries to destroy the holy ones of God. But instead, he himself is destroyed, and God's people inherit that power. That's what this is telling us here. The fourth beast was going to make war against the church, but the church was to come victorious over it. Because the church is God's kingdom. And this church that God establishes shall never be destroyed. Verse 15. I, Daniel, was troubled in the spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four very great beasts are the four kingdoms that will rise from the earth. You remember a couple of days we saw Daniel chapter 2, the vision of the idol. The head of gold is the first beast, the lion whose wings get chopped off. The silver, the chest, that's the Babylonian Empire, the bear. The third beast of bronze, that is the Greek Empire, the leopard. And the fourth beast, notice it was, the fourth part, the feet of iron, that is this fourth beast, this dragon. So we see the head of gold is the lion, which is the Babylonian Empire. The chest of silver, that's the bear, which is the Persian Empire. The belly of bronze, that's a leopard, that's a Greek Empire. And the legs of Aaron are represents Rome, the fourth beast, the dragon. And remember when we looked at the prophecy of the idol, a rock breaks and destroys the idol and grows to cover and rule the whole earth. And we see here that the Most High God destroys that beast, establishing his kingdom, which covers the whole world, never to be destroyed. Protestants like to say that the beast is the church, this and that, but when we look at the specifics, the church is not the beast. The church, the Catholic Church, is this kingdom that God establishes, never to be destroyed. Verse 19. I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, and most terrifying with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, and had the eyes and mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them. We're back to Diocletian. Emperor Diocletian waging war against the church. That terrible persecution that took place from the rise of Diocletian in the decade of the 280s and ended 20 years later with his death in 305. For you see, at this point now, Diocletian was emperor, and when he was tired of being emperor, he named other emperors to his taste to replace him, and he mainly chose people who were enemies of the Catholic Church, people who persecuted the church. Until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. Now it's on. Diocletian declares war on the church, and in so doing, he declares war on God. And God sends his judgment upon the throne of Rome, and it sets off a chain of events which, for the experts in the history of the Roman Empire, there's this thing called the crisis of the third century. Research that, the crisis of the third century. And we see how all these things start happening to the Roman Empire at that time. Civil war, not in one but four different places. Parts of the empire start succeeding. You have all these people invading. So you have Rome fighting not one, not two, not three, not four, seven wars at the same time. On top of that, during this time, a great pandemic known as the Cyprian plague takes over the entire empire, reducing its manpower by 50%. You see, this is the time when the Cyprian plague starts affecting the Roman Empire, which was, if you think of our recent COVID was contagious and deadly, that's nothing. People who lived around the time of the Cyprian plague left documents and told us that COVID was 5 times more contagious and 20 times more deadly than COVID. The Cyprian plague was twice as contagious, no, 5 times as contagious, and 20 times or something around like that than COVID. A bishop who was around told us that it was so bad, people refused to take care of their sick because they knew that if I would sit down and take care of my sick brother, the day after he died, I would be dying too. That plague was so bad that the population of farmers was chopped by half. So now you did not have people tending the harvest, causing crops to spoil in the sun, leading to famine. Now you have all these people who, in addition of dying because of the plague, were now dying because of famine. And the war going on at the same time. Cyprian of Carthage tells us that this sickness was so bad that people who would be running away from their house to avoid getting contaminated by the people in his own family would come across some other people who were dying out in the streets and still catching it. The army was chopped in half and ended up being so badly affected that Emperor Valerian, one of those 10 horns, in one single day was demoted from being an emperor to being a miserable slave in the Battle of Edessa. He goes and confronts the armies of Shapur. His army, so badly weakened by the Cyprian plague, were massacred. And Valerian, the once proud and arrogant emperor of Rome, being the footstool that Shapur of Persia used to climb his horse. Judgment was pronounced against the enemies of the church, against the Roman emperors who persecuted the Catholic Church. Um, as I watched, this horn was waging war. Verse 22. Until the end of day pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High, God declares judgment against the Roman Empire in favor of his church, and time came when they possessed the kingdom. The power, the kingdom that was once controlled by the pagan Roman emperors, is handed off to the church. Hence, we see here kind of sort of Constantine being prophesied that he would come, Constantine being the tool by which God was to send judgment on the other pagan emperors, Maxentius, Licinius, overcome them, and give freedom to the church. And many palaces that had once belonged to the enemies of the church now were passed on to bishops of the church. Verse 23. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is the fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and devour the whole earth. The entire known world would be controlled by him at one time or another, trampling it down and crushing it. 10 horns and 10 kings will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. This is Diocletian, who kills Carus, Carinus, and Numerianus. He will speak against the Most High. Diocletian thinks he is God. After all, the word Diocletian in his own native language, which was not Latin yet, Diocletian translates as the golden god. In other words, he thought that he wasn't just God, but a golden god, a god above all the other pagan gods. His arrogance. He would speak against the Most High and oppress the holy people and try to change in set times and laws. In other words, he would rule even over the emperors. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. 2 times and a half. We look at the time that the Roman Empire was in control. We take the time when Constantine takes power. Let's do this math work. Let's see. Let's open a calculator. This 3.5 has 2 meanings. I want you to join me on one of them. We're going to talk about both of these meanings rather quickly so we can see what's going on. There's a literal meaning and then there's a gematria meaning. Uh, Constantine comes to power the year 311. Let's subtract from this 311, 350 years, 3 centuries and a half, and it gives us a time of 39 BC. The Roman Empire is born with Caesar. When Caesar, let's find out, when does Caesar take control of the Roman Empire? When does Caesar take over the Roman Empire? Let's find that out. When does actually when does Israel become part of the Roman Empire? 6 AD. Okay. When does when is the Roman Empire established? 27. And we see slowly by slowly we get closer and closer um, to the time of 40 BC. Eusebius of not Eusebius, excuse me, Flavius Josephus tells us that at 40 BC the power of the Greeks is finally broken in Israel. Ah, let's ask one last question of Google. When does Herod the Great rule? 37 BC. You see, it gets us closer and closer to the year 40 BC. Now, let's get back to what we were reading, back to the scripture. That's the first of the two meanings. The Roman Empire, says Caesar, is established to the time when Constantine the Great takes power, is 3 centuries and a half. A century, 2 centuries, and half a century. Also, three and a half is half of seven. Seven, the number of perfection, the number of totality. In other words, this beast trying to claim its position as God only comes half as to have the power, to have 50% of the power of God, you could say. In other words, he is so far from it. Verse 26. But the court will sit on the court will sit. God establishes judgment, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Where is the Roman Empire now? Many people have tried to bring back the Roman Empire. None have succeeded. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. Some power and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven. So it's not just talking about symbolically the kingdom of God being on earth the way we know it means, but he's also talking about the kingdoms, the actual physical control of the kingdoms on the land that the beast had controlled. Once the beast dies off, gets handed over to the church. What happened after Constantine rises to power? Maxentius gets killed off. Licinius gets killed off. The last two emperors who persecuted the church, the last two horns of the beast, get killed off. Mind you, both of these two emperors, Maxentius and Licinius, had been given power by Diocletian before Diocletian had died. So Maxentius and Licinius still represented the power of this third horn. Of this horn that destroyed the 30 horns, came to power, and then named these two other emperors into power. Now, Constantine comes into power, destroys the last two puppets of Diocletian. He declares the Edict of Milan, giving amnesty to the church. And, and history tells us that Constantine, once he becomes the sole governing force of the Roman Empire, moves his capital to Constantinople to leave Rome for the Pope. The capital of the enemies of the church has now become the capital of the church itself. Then the Holy Most High in the kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the rulers will worship and obey him. We see Constantine moving to Constantinople, understanding that the Pope was above him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts. and my face turned pale, but I kept that matter to myself. That's why it was symbolic. That's why he described it in apocalyptic terms, because he couldn't come up and tell Belshazzar that. In short, what the prophecy is telling Daniel is that the kingdom of Babylon was to be destroyed by the kingdom of Persia after the Persian king kills the third king, who happened to be the king of Babylon. The king of Persia itself would be destroyed by the kingdom of Greece, which would be destroyed by the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire would be destroyed by God when God establishes his kingdom on earth. When God established his kingdom on earth, the church, which was to grow and grow and grow. And the enemies, its enemies, the Roman Empire, would not be able to overcome it. Praise be to God! Long live Christ the King!